Thanksgiving was supposed to be simple that year. A shared table, familiar faces, and predictable conversations. I had already planned my schedule and bought groceries to bring like I always did. Nothing felt unusual until my phone rang late on Sunday afternoon. It was my mother, Elaine. Her voice sounded polite but distant. She did not ask how I was. She did not mention the holiday. She spoke carefully, as if reading from a script. She said they had been thinking and felt it might be better if I did not attend Thanksgiving dinner this year. I asked why. There was a pause. Then she explained that the gathering would include extended family friends and people who mattered to my parents socially. She said they wanted the day to reflect certain values. She mentioned appearances. She mentioned impressions. Then she said it directly. She said my job and my current position might send the wrong message. I listened quietly. I did not interrupt. My work had never been a secret. I had chosen a stable career that paid modestly and gave me independence. It was not impressive by their standards. It did not come with titles or status, but it was honest, and it was mine. Elaine continued speaking. She said they were not ashamed of me. She said this was not personal. She said sometimes family gatherings require discretion. She framed the decision as protection for everyone involved. My father, Robert, did not speak. I could hear him in the background, but he stayed silent. His silence said more than words ever could. I asked if this decision was final. Elaine said yes. She added that it would be best for everyone if I understood and respected their choice. She said maybe next year things would be different. The call ended calmly. No raised voices, no arguments, just a quiet exclusion delivered with careful language. I sat there holding my phone longer than necessary. The apartment was quiet. The plans I had made suddenly felt irrelevant. What hurt was not missing a meal. It was the realization that I had been measured and found lacking based on criteria I never agreed to. This was not the first time my value had been assessed that way, but it was the first time the judgment came with a clear consequence. I did not call back. I did not defend myself. I did not explain my work or my choices. I had learned that explanations offered to people who have already decided do not change outcomes. They only drain energy. Instead, I canceled my travel plans and unpacked the groceries I had bought. I cooked dinner for myself that evening. I ate quietly and let the reality settle. Being excluded taught me something important. Belonging that depends on status is fragile. Acceptance that requires performance is temporary. I did not know then that this decision would eventually expose much more than my parents intended. At that moment, all I knew was that I had been judged not by my character, but by how I appeared to others. And that was only the beginning of a story I never planned to tell. The more I replayed the call, the clearer the reasoning became. My parents had not said they were embarrassed. They had not said I was unwelcome as a daughter. They had framed the decision as something responsible and thoughtful. That framing was intentional. Elaine had spoken about image, about the kind of impression a family makes when everyone is gathered in one room. Thanksgiving for them was no longer just a meal. It was a presentation, a display of success, stability, and alignment with a certain social circle. She had said they did not want to send the wrong message to relatives. That phrase stayed with me. A wrong message to whom and about what? The implication was clear. My career did not fit the story they wanted others to see. My presence would complicate the narrative they carefully maintained. They spoke as if this choice protected me as well, as if being absent would spare me uncomfortable questions or comparisons. But I knew the truth. This was not protection. It was exclusion disguised as consideration. My parents had always been sensitive to how the family was perceived. Achievements were discussed more than effort. Titles mattered more than values. Conversations revolved around who had advanced and who had stalled. In that context, my work had become an inconvenience. What made it harder was the calm way it was delivered. There was no anger to push back against, no obvious cruelty to confront. Just language that made the decision sound reasonable and unavoidable. Robert's silence weighed heavily on me. He could have spoken up. He could have asked for compromise, but he did not. His quiet agreement reinforced the message that this choice was not impulsive. It had been discussed and accepted. I realized then that I had been evaluated not as a person, but as a reflection. My role in the family was conditional. I was welcome when I enhanced the picture and quietly removed when I did not. That realization shifted something inside me. I stopped looking for hidden meaning or exceptions. I accepted what had been said at face value. They were prioritizing appearance over connection. Over the next few days, I noticed how easily the story could be repeated. They would tell relatives I was busy, or that I could not make it this year. No one would question it. The absence would be explained smoothly without conflict. I did not reach out to clarify or negotiate. I did not try to prove that my work had value. I understood that value defined by others is never stable. Instead, I paid attention. I listened more carefully to the language they used and what it revealed about their priorities. I began to see a pattern that extended far beyond one holiday. Being excluded was painful, but it was also clarifying. It showed me where I stood without illusions. It showed me that belonging in that space required conformity rather than authenticity. If you have ever been quietly pushed aside for not fitting an image, comment 1 below. Sometimes exclusion arrives wrapped in polite words. And sometimes understanding that truth is the first step toward reclaiming your own sense of worth. I did not yet know how this story would unfold, but I knew that the reasons given were only the surface, and beneath them lay choices that would eventually come back into the open. After the call, I did not respond the way I once would have. In the past, I might have explained my work in detail or listed achievements to justify my place. This time, I chose silence, not as punishment, not as strategy, simply as a decision to stop performing. I did not argue with Elaine. I did not ask Robert to intervene. I did not send follow-up messages trying to soften the outcome. I understood that debate would only turn the moment into a negotiation where my worth was the topic. I was no longer willing to participate in that. Silence felt unfamiliar at first. There was an urge to fill the space, to defend my choices, to be understood. But I noticed something important. The urge was about comfort, not clarity. It was about easing tension rather than changing reality. So I let the silence stand. Over the next few days, my parents did not reach out again. There were no updates, no revisions, no invitations quietly restored. Their decision remained intact. That confirmed what I already sensed. The exclusion was not accidental. It was intentional and final. I went about my routine instead. I focused on work. I took longer walks. I cooked meals slowly. The quiet gave me room to think without reacting. It allowed me to separate what hurt from what mattered. I realized that my absence would not disrupt their holiday. It would fit neatly into their version of events. That knowledge removed the illusion that my presence had ever been essential to their sense of family. Choosing not to explain myself did not mean I accepted their judgment. It meant I refused to validate it. I did not owe anyone a performance of success or an argument for belonging. Friends asked if I was traveling for Thanksgiving. I said no and left it there. I did not share details. I did not dramatize it. I was not ashamed of the truth, but I did not feel the need to carry it everywhere. What surprised me was the calm that followed. Not relief. Calm. The kind that comes when you stop pushing against something that will not move. Silence also revealed something else. Without my explanations, there was nothing for them to respond to. No opening for revision. No opportunity to reframe their decision as misunderstanding. The boundary held because I did not try to soften it. I spent Thanksgiving alone that year. I cooked a simple meal and ate it without distraction. I thought about the patterns that had led to this moment, about how often I had stayed quiet before, but for different reasons. Back then, silence was about endurance. This time, it was about choice. There is a difference between being silent because you feel small and being silent because you are done negotiating your value. I did not know then what would come next. I did not anticipate how this quiet decision would eventually shift the balance. But I felt something settle inside me. A line had been drawn without words. Sometimes the most meaningful withdrawal is not dramatic. It is calm. It is intentional. And it creates space for truth to surface later without being forced. That was the moment I stepped back not to disappear but to observe. And in stepping back, I unknowingly set the stage for everything that followed. My life at that time was quieter than most people assumed. I lived simply by choice, not by limitation. My apartment was modest, clean, and functional. It was not designed to impress anyone. It was designed to let me breathe. My income was stable but ordinary. I earned enough to pay my bills, save consistently, and live without anxiety. I did not chase luxury. I did not measure success by comparison. My work gave me structure, purpose, and independence. That mattered more to me than titles. I woke early most days. I made my own coffee. I walked to work when weather allowed. I kept routines because they grounded me. Nothing about my life looked dramatic from the outside, and that was intentional. I rarely spoke about money, even with friends. Not because it was secret, but because it was not central to how I defined myself. I believe that once money becomes the loudest part of a conversation, everything else becomes secondary. I also avoided discussing family matters. I had learned over time that explaining my background invited assumptions. People expected stories of privilege or conflict. I preferred not to feed either narrative. What my parents did not understand was that simplicity was not a failure to aspire. It was a form of control. I chose predictability over spectacle. I chose clarity over competition. I never corrected them when they implied I was underachieving. Not because I believed it, but because I did not feel the need to argue against a story they were committed to telling. My life did not need their validation to function. There were moments when I could have presented myself differently. I could have emphasized connections, influence, or access. I chose not to. Power spoken too loudly often attracts the wrong attention. Instead, I focused on consistency, paying rent on time, doing my job well, maintaining relationships that did not revolve around status. These choices kept my world steady, even when family dynamics were not. People who met me casually often underestimated me. I did not correct that either. I found that assumptions reveal more about the observer than the subject. Being underestimated gave me space to move without pressure. My parents saw my lifestyle as evidence of stagnation. They did not see the discipline behind it. They did not ask what I valued. They assumed simplicity meant lack of ambition. What they missed was that I was not building a life to display. I was building one to live in. Thanksgiving highlighted that difference. Their gathering was about presentation. My absence fit their narrative because it removed a contrast they did not want to explain. I did not resent my life. I was comfortable in it. I felt grounded and capable. That sense of stability made their exclusion painful but not destabilizing. The quiet way I lived became my anchor. It allowed me to respond to judgment without internal chaos. It reminded me that worth does not need to announce itself. At that point in the story, nothing about my situation looked powerful, and that was exactly why no one was paying attention. There was one detail my parents never asked about and never imagined mattered. I had never volunteered it, and no one had ever connected it to me. That was the point. Several years earlier, my younger sister Clara had received a significant inheritance through our extended family. The amount was substantial enough to require formal structure and long-term oversight. At the time, Clara was not prepared to manage it herself. The decision that followed was not emotional. It was legal and deliberate. I was appointed the sole legal guardian and trustee of the inheritance fund. That meant the responsibility rested entirely with me. Every distribution, every request, every long-term decision. The authority was documented and binding. It did not come with visibility or status. It came with accountability. I never spoke about it publicly, not to friends, not to colleagues, and certainly not to my parents. The role required discretion, and more importantly, it required stability. I treated it like any other responsibility, quietly and carefully. Clara trusted me. The legal advisors trusted me. The structure existed to protect her future, not to elevate my position. I never viewed it as leverage or power. It was stewardship. The inheritance was not something I touched casually. Funds were allocated with intention and restraint. Education, health, long-term planning, nothing extravagant, nothing impulsive. Every decision followed the framework established at the beginning. My parents assumed that because my lifestyle was modest, I had no access to anything beyond my salary. They never questioned that assumption. It fit their narrative, and I did not correct it. What they did not realize was that control does not always announce itself. Sometimes it sits quietly in documents and responsibilities no one bothers to read. I understood early on that revealing this role would change how people treated me. It would shift conversations and expectations. I did not want that. I wanted clarity, not influence. So I kept it separate from my identity. Thanksgiving exclusion made that separation clearer. The same people who dismissed my value based on appearances had no idea they depended indirectly on decisions I made responsibly every year. I did not feel smug about that. I did not feel validated. I felt resolved. Because the truth was not meant to embarrass anyone. It existed to protect someone I cared about. And protection does not require an audience. I continued my life as before. I paid my bills. I showed up for work. I managed the trust quietly. Nothing about my day-to-day changed. What changed was my understanding of how fragile assumptions are, how easily people mistake simplicity for insignificance, how often power is ignored because it does not perform. If you have ever carried responsibility in silence, comment one below. Sometimes the most important roles are the ones no one sees until they matter. At that moment, my parents had no idea what they had excluded, and I had no intention of correcting them. The truth was not a tool to be used in reaction. It was something that would surface only when necessary. And when it did, it would not need explanation. What made the situation more revealing was how completely unaware my parents were of my legal role. They had never asked about it. They had never suspected it. In their minds, my life fit neatly into a category they had already defined. To them, I was the practical daughter with an ordinary job and an unremarkable routine. They believed they understood my limits because they had decided where those limits were. Anything outside that framework simply did not register. The inheritance had been handled through formal channels with advisors who valued discretion. There were no announcements, no family meetings, no conversations over dinner. The structure was designed that way intentionally. Privacy protected everyone involved. When the documents were finalized, my parents were informed only that the matter was settled appropriately. They did not inquire further. They trusted that someone else was handling it. They assumed it could not possibly involve me. That assumption was convenient. It allowed them to continue seeing me as dependent rather than responsible. It allowed them to dismiss my choices without considering unseen context. I noticed over time how often they spoke about money and influence as if those things were always visible. In their world, success announced itself. It showed up in titles, cars, invitations, and public recognition. Quiet responsibility did not count. They often spoke about Clara Future with confidence, as if they knew how it was being managed. They spoke about access and plans they did not control. They never realized that the structure protecting her future operated independently of their expectations. I never corrected their understanding, not out of secrecy, but out of respect for the process. The role required neutrality. It was not mine to leverage for validation or defense. Their lack of awareness also revealed something deeper. They were comfortable forming judgments without complete information. They were satisfied with surfaces. They did not ask because they did not believe there was anything to learn. Thanksgiving made that gap visible. They excluded me based on what they believed they knew. They never considered that the person they dismissed might be carrying responsibility that did not fit their story. That realization did not make me angry. It made me observant. I began to see how often power is misjudged because it does not perform. How authority grounded in documents and process can exist entirely outside social narratives. My parents believed control came from appearance and alignment. They believed influence required proximity to status. They did not recognize that real authority often functions quietly until it is required. I continued interacting with them as before. Polite, neutral, distant. I did not hint at anything they did not know. There was no advantage in doing so. Their ignorance created a strange imbalance. They spoke with certainty while lacking crucial context. They made decisions assuming nothing would challenge them. At the time, that imbalance felt abstract. It did not yet have consequence, but it shaped everything that followed. Because when people act without understanding the full picture, they often reveal more than they intend to. And when the truth eventually enters the conversation, it does not need to argue. It simply exists. At that stage, my parents believed they were in control of the narrative. They had no idea how incomplete it was. That gap between belief and reality was widening quietly. and I could feel that it would not stay hidden forever. As the months passed, the silence around Thanksgiving slowly gave way to subtle changes. Nothing dramatic happened at first. There were no emergency calls or urgent requests, but the tone of family conversations began to shift in ways that were easy to miss unless you were paying attention. My parents started mentioning expenses more often, repairs that had been postponed, plans that suddenly required careful timing. They spoke about investments that were not performing as expected. The confidence they once carried softened into caution. At the same time, references to Clara's future became more frequent. Questions appeared wrapped in concern. How was she feeling about her plans? Whether she had thought about long-term stability, whether she might need additional support sooner than expected. I listened without responding. I did not ask follow-up questions. I let the conversations move where they wanted to go. It became clear that something had shifted financially. Not collapse, but pressure. The kind that forces people to reconsider assumptions they once held comfortably. The kind that makes resources suddenly feel closer and more relevant. My parents began speaking about the inheritance with a new tone. They framed it as family planning, as foresight, as responsibility. They spoke as if access was a matter of coordination rather than authority. They assumed those decisions would eventually pass through them. That was always how they spoke, as if management and control were natural extensions of their role. They did not question that assumption any more than they had questioned their judgment of me. I noticed how easily the narrative adjusted. Where once my absence was justified by image, now conversations focused on unity and cooperation. Family became important again when resources felt tighter. Still, no one contacted me directly about the fund. Not yet, but the groundwork was being laid. The language softened, the distance shortened, politeness replaced dismissal. I understood what was happening without needing confirmation. The inheritance had moved from abstract future to practical consideration. And when money moves closer, people often reveal priorities they had previously hidden. What struck me was not the need itself. Financial pressure can happen to anyone. It was the expectation of access without accountability. The assumption that decisions would be made by default rather than by structure. They did not realize that access required process, that authority was defined, that responsibility had already been assigned long ago. I continued managing the trust as I always had, carefully, conservatively, with Clara's best interests in mind. Nothing about the fund changed, only the attention around it did. I did not feel vindicated. I felt alert. There is a moment when silence becomes informative. When you see how people reposition themselves without acknowledging the shift. That moment had arrived. My parents had excluded me when they believed I had nothing to offer their image. Now they were circling closer, without understanding why the ground beneath them felt different. I remained calm. I did not anticipate confrontation. I anticipated clarity. Time has a way of exposing gaps between belief and reality, and when those gaps widen, pressure follows. I did not yet know how directly that pressure would be applied, but I understood that the quiet phase was ending. The story was moving forward, not because I spoke, but because circumstances were changing. And change has a way of drawing attention to truths that were once conveniently ignored. The first message arrived without context. It was short and unexpectedly gentle. My mother, Elaine, asked how I had been and whether work was going well. There was no mention of Thanksgiving, no reference to the distance that had followed, just concern presented as if nothing had happened. A few days later, my father Robert called. His tone was softer than I remembered. He asked about my schedule and said it had been too long since we talked. He spoke carefully as if testing unfamiliar ground. The shift was noticeable. Where conversations once felt clipped, they now felt open. Where silence had stood, there was sudden interest. They asked questions they had not asked in years, about my routine, about my plans, about whether I felt supported. I listened more than I spoke. I did not confront the change or comment on it. I allowed it to unfold on its own. Elaine mentioned how important family was during uncertain times. She said it reminded her of how quickly things can change. She said she hoped we could reconnect more intentionally. Nothing she said was unkind. Nothing was explicit, but the contrast was sharp. The same person who had excluded me months earlier was now inviting conversation. I did not assume malice. I did not assume sincerity either. I simply noticed the timing. Their concern felt measured, almost strategic. It arrived alongside the subtle financial conversations I had been hearing. It coincided with the increased attention toward Clara's future. It did not exist in isolation. I responded politely. I answered questions briefly. I did not offer details beyond what was asked. I did not bring up the past. I did not accept invitations immediately. The softness did not erase memory. It sat on top of it. What stood out most was how quickly the tone changed without acknowledgement. There was no apology for the exclusion, no recognition of the hurt, just a reset attempt without accountability. That absence mattered. I realized then that reconciliation was being offered conditionally, on the assumption that the past could be skipped, that proximity could return without repair. I was not angry. I was attentive. When people change tone without changing behavior, it is often because circumstances have shifted, not because understanding has deepened. I did not reject the outreach. I did not embrace it either. I kept my footing steady. Elaine suggested meeting for coffee. Robert mentioned dinner sometime soon. They framed it as catching up, as rebuilding connection. I said I would think about it. Inside, I understood what was happening. Interest follows access. Warmth follows need. And concern often appears when something becomes relevant again. The change confirmed what I had sensed earlier. My value in their eyes was still linked to what I represented rather than who I was. This time, I did not rush to meet their expectations. I did not step forward to fill the space they reopened. I waited. Because true reconciliation does not arrive quietly and selectively, it arrives with honesty. If you have ever noticed a sudden change in tone when circumstances shift, comment 1 below. Sometimes softness is not growth. Sometimes it is strategy. I did not yet know how this renewed contact would unfold, but I knew I would not return to the old pattern. The silence I had chosen earlier had taught me something important. Calm observation reveals far more than confrontation, and I intended to keep observing. I chose not to reveal anything, not because I was hiding, not because I was afraid of their reaction, but because timing matters when truth carries weight. If I spoke too early, the conversation would shift immediately. Questions would sharpen. Intentions would change. The calm observation I had gained would disappear. I was not interested in provoking a response. I wanted to understand it. So I stayed where I was. When Elaine asked about my work, I answered honestly but briefly. When Robert asked about my plans, I kept them general. I did not volunteer information that would redirect their focus. I let them speak. What I noticed was how their questions evolved. At first, they were polite and distant. Then they became more specific. Elaine asked whether I felt secure long-term. Robert asked whether I ever felt overwhelmed managing responsibilities. The words responsibility and future appeared more often. They spoke about Clara with concern that felt rehearsed. They asked how she was doing, whether she felt supported, whether she had mentioned anything about needing guidance. I listened carefully. I did not interrupt. I did not correct assumptions. I simply noted patterns. Their interest was not random. It moved in a direction. It circled the same themes: stability, access, planning, control. I noticed how often they used inclusive language. We should think ahead. The family needs alignment. Everyone should be on the same page. These phrases sounded cooperative, but carried expectation. Still, no one asked me directly about the inheritance. They did not need to. They spoke as if authority naturally flowed through them, as if coordination was inevitable. That assumption fascinated me. They had excluded me without hesitation when they believed I had nothing to contribute to their image. Now they were speaking as if collaboration was a given. The contrast was striking. I remained calm. I did not challenge them. I did not confirm anything either. Observation requires restraint. It requires allowing people to reveal themselves without interference. That is what I was doing. I noticed how Elaine softened her tone when discussing finances, how Robert avoided specifics, how both of them framed access as care rather than control. They never acknowledged the past exclusion. It sat unspoken between us. I realized they expected it to dissolve on its own. That expectation told me everything I needed to know. If I revealed the truth now, it would be framed as leverage, as retaliation. That was not what it was. The truth existed independently of their behavior. So I waited. Waiting was not passive, it was intentional. It allowed clarity to form without distortion. I continued my routine. I managed the trust as always. I supported Clara quietly. Nothing about my responsibilities changed. What changed was my understanding of my parents' motivations. They were not reaching out because they had reflected. They were reaching out because circumstances had shifted. That distinction mattered. I did not judge them harshly. I did not feel superior. I simply adjusted my expectations. I learned that revealing truth too early can turn it into a negotiation. Revealing it at the right moment allows it to stand on its own. I was not planning a confrontation. I was allowing a situation to unfold naturally. People often assume silence means weakness. They rarely realize it can mean readiness. I stayed silent and continued observing. And with each conversation, their intentions became clearer without me having to say a word. The truth did not need to rush. It was already in place. It would surface when it no longer needed explanation. The invitation arrived quietly, but it carried weight. It was for a large public gala hosted by a foundation my parents had supported for years. The event was formal, high profile, the kind of gathering where appearances mattered and reputations circulated freely. Elaine mentioned it during one of our calls, as if in passing. She said it might be nice if I attended. She framed it as an opportunity to reconnect publicly and show unity. Her tone suggested this was not just a suggestion. I agreed to go without hesitation. Not because I wanted visibility, not because I needed validation, but because public spaces reveal truths private conversations can avoid. A room full of witnesses changes how people behave. The gala took place on a Friday evening downtown. The venue was expansive and carefully curated. Soft lighting, polished floors, names printed on place cards. Every detail designed to signal influence. I arrived early and took my seat quietly. I did not seek out my parents. I did not avoid them either. I let the evening unfold naturally. As guests arrived, I noticed familiar patterns. My parents moved confidently through the room, greeting donors and board members. They looked comfortable, established, in control. When they saw me, Elaine smiled broadly. The warmth felt performative. Robert nodded approvingly. They introduced me to others with vague descriptions. This is our daughter. She works in the nonprofit space. They did not elaborate. I did not correct them. As the night progressed, speeches began. Names were recognized, contributions acknowledged. Applause moved through the room in waves. Status was reinforced through ritual. Then a moment arrived that shifted the tone. During a presentation about long-term funding, the conversation turned toward legacy and stewardship. The speaker referenced Clara by name and spoke about the trust supporting her future. It was a brief mention, but it was public. The room reacted with polite interest. Heads turned. Whispers followed. Elaine stiffened beside me. Robert's expression changed. They looked at each other briefly, then back at the stage. The speaker continued and mentioned the trustee responsible for oversight. My name followed. There was no emphasis, no drama, just a fact stated plainly. The room accepted it without reaction. For them, it was information. For my parents, it was revelation. I felt the shift immediately. The balance in the room changed without a word being spoken. My parents' posture altered. Their confidence wavered. Their assumptions cracked. They did not interrupt. They did not ask questions. Not yet. The gala continued as planned. Music resumed. Conversations restarted. But the atmosphere around my family had changed. I did not feel exposed. I felt aligned. The truth had surfaced organically. It did not require explanation. Elaine tried to speak to me but hesitated. Robert remained silent. They were recalibrating in real time. This was not a confrontation. It was clarity delivered in a space where denial could not survive. Public settings do not amplify emotion. They amplify facts. I stayed calm. I did not react. I did not explain. I let the moment pass. What mattered was not how others saw me. It was how my parents saw the gap between what they believed and what was true. The gala had become the turning point not because of spectacle, but because of context. The truth landed where it could not be reframed or dismissed. That was the moment everything shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. The realization did not arrive all at once for my parents. It unfolded slowly across the rest of the evening. In conversations they overheard, in introductions that were no longer vague, in glances that lingered a second too long, people approached me with polite interest, not admiration, not surprise, just acknowledgement. They spoke about stewardship and responsibility as if it were normal, because in that room it was. One woman thanked me for the care I had taken in managing long-term resources. A man mentioned how rare it was to see consistency and oversight over many years. These were not compliments meant to impress. They were observations shared casually among people who understood process. My parents stood close enough to hear, but far enough not to interrupt. Elaine's smile remained fixed, but her eyes followed every exchange. Robert listened carefully. The story they had told themselves was no longer holding. What made the moment undeniable was not volume or announcement. It was repetition. My role was referenced again and again in different conversations. Each time it sounded the same. Calm, factual, established. No one treated it as news. That was the part that mattered. The truth did not feel disruptive to the room. It felt integrated, which meant it had existed long before my parents noticed it. I did not explain my position. I did not clarify authority. I did not justify decisions. The structure spoke for itself. The people who mattered already understood how it worked. Elaine eventually approached me quietly. She asked how long this had been in place. Her voice was controlled but tight. I answered honestly. For several years. She asked why she had not known. I told her it was not something that required announcement. That response ended the conversation. Robert did not speak at all. What became clear in that moment was how differently truth behaves when it appears in public without intention. There was no space to reframe it as misunderstanding, no way to recast it as exaggeration. It existed in a room where verification mattered. My parents were not embarrassed by others. They were confronted by their own assumptions. That was harder to manage. The people around us continued their evening. Plates were cleared. Music returned. The event moved forward, but the internal shift had already happened. I felt no satisfaction, only stillness. This was not about power changing hands. It was about power being revealed where it already existed. I did not stay long after that. I thanked the hosts and left quietly. I did not look for my parents before I went. Later that night, my phone buzzed with messages I did not open. I did not need to read them to know their tone had changed. The truth had surfaced without confrontation. It did not ask permission. It did not need defense. If you have ever watched assumptions fall apart in silence, comment 1 below. Sometimes the most powerful revelations arrive without drama. I went home that night knowing something fundamental had shifted, not in my life, but in how others understood it. What followed would not be immediate. There would be conversations and consequences, but the most important part was already complete. The truth had entered the room, and it had stayed. The days after the gala were marked by an unfamiliar silence. It was not the silence of distance I had chosen before. It was the silence of disorientation. My parents did not know how to speak now that the story they relied on no longer worked. Elaine called twice the following week. Both times she ended the call quickly. Her questions lacked direction. She asked how I was, and then paused as if waiting for a cue that never came. The confidence that once guided her conversations was gone. Robert sent a message asking if we could talk soon. He did not specify why. He did not suggest a topic. The message felt tentative, as if he was unsure what position he held in the conversation anymore. What stood out most was the absence of persuasion. There were no attempts to reframe what had happened, no claims of misunderstanding, no emotional leverage. The usual tools were missing. They could not deny what had been stated publicly. They could not question it without revealing how little they had known. And they could not manipulate the situation without exposing themselves further. For the first time, my parents were not directing the narrative. They were reacting to it. Family group messages slowed. Conversations became cautious. Relatives who had once spoken freely now chose their words carefully. The hierarchy had shifted and no one wanted to misstep. Clara called me privately. She sounded confused but calm. She asked why she was only now learning details others seemed to know already. I explained gently and honestly. I told her the structure had always been there to protect her. Nothing more. She did not ask me to change anything. She did not question my role. She thanked me and ended the call. That response mattered. The shock my parents experienced was not about money. It was about loss of control. They could not maneuver around documents. They could not pressure a room that had already accepted the truth. I noticed how often Elaine paused mid-sentence now. How often she seemed to search for the right tone. Manipulation requires certainty. Without it, language loses power. They were no longer deciding how to approach me. They were unsure whether they were allowed to. I did not confront them. I did not demand acknowledgement. I allowed the confusion to exist. It was not my responsibility to resolve it for them. Shock has a way of revealing dependency. When people rely on influence, they rarely prepare for the moment it stops working. I remained steady. I did not change my behavior. I did not seek reassurance. I continued my routine and let the new reality settle. What I understood then was that truth does not need to argue. Once it is established, it limits options. It narrows the field until only honest responses remain. My parents were not angry. They were uncertain, and uncertainty made them cautious. That was new. They had always believed authority came from proximity and appearance. Now they were facing a structure that existed without them. The confusion was not something I enjoyed watching, but it confirmed something important. Manipulation only works when the other person doubts themselves. I did not doubt myself anymore, and because of that, nothing they said next could move the ground beneath me. The story had passed a point of no return. The shift in power did not arrive with confrontation or declaration. It settled quietly into place and stayed there. What had changed was not my behavior, but how decisions now moved around me. For years, my parents had spoken with certainty. They decided what mattered. They defined success. They assumed authority simply because no one challenged it. I had existed on the margins of that structure, accepted when convenient, dismissed when not. Now that structure no longer held. Requests that once would have come as instructions arrived as questions. Elaine asked whether certain plans were possible. Robert asked if timing might be flexible. Their language had changed without them acknowledging it. I noticed how careful they were, how often they paused before speaking. They were no longer assuming access. They were waiting for it. What reversed was not status, but agency. I did not need permission to act. They needed permission to proceed. That distinction reshaped every interaction. The irony was not lost on me. The same people who had excluded me because I did not fit their image were now dependent on decisions made quietly over years. Decisions they had never noticed because they had never looked beyond appearances. I did not announce this reversal. I did not reference the past. I let it exist without commentary. Power that needs to be asserted is fragile. Power grounded in structure does not need to speak. When conversations turned toward the future, I responded with clarity. I asked questions, I requested details, I emphasized process. Not control, but responsibility. Elaine struggled with this adjustment. She had spent years guiding outcomes through tone and suggestion. That approach no longer worked. The rules were different now, and they were not hers to set. Robert adapted more quickly. He listened more. He spoke less. He seemed to understand that something fundamental had changed and could not be negotiated back. What surprised me most was how natural it felt. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel vindicated. I felt aligned. This was not a victory. It was a correction. The role I held had always carried authority. It simply had not been visible to those who judged by surface markers. Now visibility had arrived, not because I sought it, but because circumstances required it. Clara remained at the center of my focus. Every decision continued to be made with her well-being in mind. That did not change. What changed was who recognized that authority. I did not use this shift to settle scores. I did not restrict access out of spite. I maintained the same standards I always had. Consistency mattered more than reaction. What my parents were experiencing was not punishment. It was consequence. They had built a hierarchy based on assumptions. When those assumptions collapsed, the hierarchy followed. They were learning in real time that influence does not come from position alone. It comes from responsibility carried over time. I watched this adjustment with distance. I did not rush to fill the silence or ease their discomfort. That discomfort was part of the learning. Power reversed does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like hesitation where there was once certainty. Sometimes it looks like restraint replacing entitlement. The person once dismissed does not need to change to be respected. The environment changes around them. That was the moment I understood how completely the balance had shifted. Not because I demanded it, but because the truth had rearranged the room, and once rearranged, it could not be put back the way it was. What surprised many people later was what I did not do next. I did not confront my parents. I did not list grievances. I did not remind them of the Thanksgiving call or the words they had used to justify excluding me. I did not seek apology or validation. I also did not retaliate. There was no satisfaction in reversing roles, no desire to make them feel small. I understood that humiliation would not teach what boundaries were meant to protect. It would only repeat the same pattern with different positions. Instead, I stayed exactly where I had always been. I followed the legal framework in place. Nothing more, nothing less. Every decision related to the inheritance continued to move through established process. Requests were reviewed formally. Conversations stayed factual. I did not allow urgency or emotion to bypass structure. That consistency mattered. My parents tested this at first. Elaine hinted that flexibility would help heal the family. Robert suggested that exceptions might smooth tension. They framed it as reconciliation. I listened and responded calmly. I explained that my role required neutrality, that discretion protected everyone involved, that boundaries were not negotiable based on comfort. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse them of manipulation. I simply restated the terms as they existed. This approach frustrated Elaine. She was used to emotional leverage, used to tone shaping outcomes. That method no longer applied. There was nothing personal to push against, only structure. Robert accepted it more quietly. He seemed to understand that pushing further would only confirm what had already been revealed. What mattered most to me was that Clara remained protected. The trust existed for her stability, not for family politics. I kept that focus steady and visible. People sometimes confuse restraint with passivity. This was not that. This was discipline. I had learned that revenge requires ongoing engagement. Boundaries require maintenance, but not obsession. I chose the latter. There were moments when I could have said more, moments when silence felt heavy, but I reminded myself that clarity does not require commentary. It requires consistency. I did not remove access out of spite. I did not tighten controls to prove a point. I kept everything exactly as it had been before the truth surfaced. That was the strongest statement I could make. Over time, the message became clear without being spoken. I was not seeking dominance. I was maintaining responsibility. My parents adjusted slowly. They stopped hinting. They stopped testing. They began treating the structure as fixed rather than temporary. That shift was not dramatic. It was gradual, and it was real. By refusing to retaliate, I kept the focus where it belonged, on process, on protection, on long-term consequence rather than short-term emotion. If you have ever been given the chance to strike back but chose restraint instead, comment one below. Sometimes the most powerful response is refusing to play the same game. What I learned was this: boundaries do not need to be defended loudly. They only need to be enforced consistently. I did not need to punish anyone. The situation itself had already changed the dynamic. By standing still and holding the line, I preserved my integrity and my peace. And in doing so, I made it clear that my silence was not weakness, it was resolve. The realization did not come to my parents all at once. It arrived in fragments. In moments when a request was answered with procedure instead of warmth, in pauses where authority used to be assumed, in the quiet understanding that some things could not be undone. Elaine struggled with this most. She had believed that distance could be repaired with tone, that exclusion could be softened later with concern. She was learning that choices made for image leave marks that time alone cannot erase. There were moments when she tried to revisit the past without naming it. She would say things like, "We all make mistakes," or "families go through phases." The words hovered without landing. They did not reach me because they did not include responsibility. Robert saw it differently. He was less expressive, but more observant. He noticed how conversations had changed, how decisions no longer flowed through habit, but through structure. He understood that the ground had shifted permanently. What they were facing was not punishment, it was consequence. They had measured me by appearance and excluded me when I did not enhance their narrative. That choice revealed priorities that could not be unseen. Trust does not break loudly. It erodes quietly when actions contradict connection. They realized that reconciliation now required more than access. It required acknowledgement. And acknowledgement requires admitting that harm occurred. That step was not easy for them. Elaine once asked if things could go back to how they were. The question carried hope and fear. I answered honestly. I said things do not return to what they were. They become something else. That was the truth. I was not closing the door. I was refusing to pretend it had never been shut. The consequence they were facing was not loss of control. It was loss of assumption. They could no longer assume proximity. They could no longer assume forgiveness without accountability. They could no longer assume silence meant agreement. They began to understand that their earlier certainty had cost them something lasting. Not access to money, not authority, but intimacy. When you decide someone does not belong, you cannot later demand closeness without repair. This realization was uncomfortable. It forced reflection rather than reaction. It asked questions they had avoided for years, about how they valued people, about what they prioritized when no one was watching. I did not rush this process. I did not guide them through it. It was not my responsibility to manage their understanding. I remained consistent, polite, clear, boundaried. That consistency made the consequence unavoidable. It showed them that I was not withholding out of anger. I was protecting alignment. Over time, the weight of that truth settled. They stopped asking for exceptions. They stopped framing reconciliation as a favor I should accept. They began to sit with what had happened. I saw moments of regret. I also saw moments of resistance. Growth is rarely linear. What mattered was that they finally recognized something irreversible. The relationship had changed because their actions had changed it first. They had made a choice based on image and status. That choice revealed how conditional their acceptance had been. And once that is revealed, it cannot be unseen. I did not need to remind them. The new dynamic did that on its own. Sometimes the most lasting consequence is not separation. It is clarity. They were learning that clarity now, and so was I. The story was no longer about power or control. It was about accountability and the quiet cost of choosing appearance over connection. That understanding marked the end of one chapter. What came next would be shaped not by reaction, but by whether responsibility could finally meet truth. Looking back now, the story feels quieter than it once did. What began with exclusion and judgment did not end with confrontation or victory. It ended with understanding, not the kind that feels comforting, but the kind that changes how you move forward. I was excluded because my life did not fit an image. I was dismissed because my value was measured by surface markers rather than substance. And for a long time, I believed that explaining myself might change that. It did not. What changed everything was not argument. It was consistency. Silence paired with responsibility. Preparation paired with restraint. I learned that respect does not come from titles or labels. It comes from how you show up when no one is watching. It comes from decisions made carefully and carried quietly over time. Real power does not announce itself. It does not demand attention. It exists in structure and follow-through and in accountability. It does not need to prove anything because it is already doing the work. There was a time when I thought staying silent meant losing ground. Now I understand that silence chosen intentionally can be grounding. It creates space to observe, to understand, and to act when the moment truly matters. Preparation gave me clarity. It removed the need to react. It allowed the truth to surface on its own terms, and when it did not need defense. This story was never about money. It was about boundaries, about what happens when you stop negotiating your worth, about what changes when you choose alignment over approval. My parents learned something through this process. So did I. Relationships do not survive on appearances. They survive on honesty and respect. And when those are missing, no amount of performance can replace them. If you have ever been judged by how you look rather than who you are, if you have ever been pushed aside quietly for not fitting a narrative, this story is for you. You do not need to raise your voice to be heard. You do not need to expose yourself to be powerful. Sometimes the strongest move is staying steady and letting reality speak. If this story resonated with you, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Your support helps these stories reach others who are navigating similar situations. Leave a comment below and share what part of this journey stood out to you most. Your perspective matters, and this space is built on thoughtful conversation. And if you want to continue this journey with us, stay tuned for the next story on the channel, where we explore how boundaries shape healing and how quiet strength creates lasting change. Because protecting your peace is not selfish, and respect earned through integrity lasts longer than approval earned through performance. Thank you for being here.